Hey guys, welcome back to the real Mr.Beer. This is our own channel here on Twitch TV. Thanks for joining us. My name is Josh Ratliff. I am the brewmaster here at Mr.Beer. I manage our little homebrew store we have on site called Everything Homebrew, and I'm a BJCP certified beer judge. Today we're going to be going over using herbs, spices in your beers. We've talked about fruit in the past and other items like that. We haven't really gone in depth into using spices or herbs. And this is, this covers a whole wide range of different flavorings you can add to your beer. Just for a little bit of reference, spices were actually used in beer long before hops were ever used. And hops is considered a spice in beer, but it is one of the main ingredients now. So it's not really considered a spice, it's just considered hops, an ingredient in beer. Yeah, for about 8,000 years before people were even using hops, people were using other spices in beer. So beer produced without hops is 8,000 years older than the history of beer produced with hops, which has only been, I think, the past 1,000 years or so. So instead of hops, what they did to balance because if you just use malt, just use barley or grains in your beer, it's going to come out very sweet, which might not be good for drinking large quantities of it. And barley in itself is not a very good preservative, so the beer would actually go bad a lot earlier. And one of the original intents of beer was to be able to have a beverage that you could drink without getting sick, because water in some parts of the world, back in different historical times, medieval times, could get you really sick. So fermenting and adding different preservatives such as hops is a way to keep the beer from spoiling, so it'll last a very long time. So some of these things that were traditionally used in beer a long time ago would be like yarrow, wormwood, anise, allspice, all kinds of different things. Licorice root was one of the first original bittering compounds to not only help balance the beer, but also to help preserve it. I'm not sure how much of a preservative licorice root is, but again, back in those days, they experimented with everything to try to get the best shelf life out of their beers possible, because remember, a lot of these places didn't have refrigeration back then. Nowadays, if you make a beer without hops and you use like the old style, usually medieval type of recipes, healing recipes, things like that, they're known as gruits if it's a beer made with other bittering herbs or spices instead of hops. It's known as a gruit, G-R-U-I-T. So that's what they're called today. And for a while in Europe, you couldn't call a beer unless it had hops in it. If it didn't have hops, it was known as an ale. And that's kind of how the distinction between beer and ale was. But that's all blended together. Now beer's ale and ale's beer. And nowadays, hops are one of the most predominant ingredients, but spices are still used to enhance the beer's flavor. Not every style of beer uses spices, but there are many that I'm sure you're familiar with, especially Belgian beers. Wit beers, in particular, used to use, traditionally they would have chamomile added to them. Chamomile and coriander, things like that. Saisons can also benefit from the use of spices, but you got to be careful with saisons because the saison yeast is kind of spicy in its own right. Some Belgian yeast, wheat yeast too. Wheat yeast can preserve a phenolic that's really similar to clove. So if you're making a wheat beer with a wheat yeast and you add cloves into that, it might be a little bit overwhelming. So sometimes the yeast will produce these spicy flavors without having to add any spices at all. Some other styles, winter warmers, some of the especially the Americanized ones, use a lot of different spices. The English ones, they're just really malty, high alcohol beers typically, but sometimes they'll add a little bit of cinnamon or nutmeg or something in there. Pumpkin beers, which is probably the most common spiced beer, especially here in the States. They use a lot of spices such as orange peel. Let's see, we've got some here. Orange peel, coriander, clove, allspice, things like that, to kind of get those pumpkin flavors you might be used to. And while these are more common styles, you can add spices to any style. You know, there are even IPAs. People are starting to add tea, you know, like black tea or green tea into their IPAs. You can do stouts and porters are really nice with sometimes a little bit of anise or some cocoa nibs, which yes, you would consider a spice. And that kind of goes back to lemon peel I was just talking about. While lemon is typically a fruit, when you're using the zest, you're really going to be using the fruit of citrus in a lot of beers. You're mostly going to be using the zest because the fruit is mostly going to be a lot of acidity and juices and sugars, whereas the zest itself doesn't really have any sugar in it, and it's just full of these really potent oils that really give you that grapefruit or orange or lemon flavors. Lemon in particular, you got to be careful with. You overdo it and your beer is going to smell and taste like lemon pledge. So orange, grapefruit, lime you can be a little more liberal with, but lemon, be very careful. So yes, lemon peel would be considered a spice since there's no sugar in it, there's no fermentation coming from it, it's only providing flavor. The same with cocoa nibs, that would also be considered a spice. Some beers might just focus on a single spice, like you might have a cinnamon stout, you know, or something like that. Some Gozes, which is a German kind of sour, kind of salty beer, will typically just focus on coriander. These days, a lot of wit beers, which, like I said, traditionally had chamomile in them as well. These days, a lot of people just use coriander, but you will find some classic examples at some good breweries with some chamomile in it, which really does give a kind of extra dimension of a little bit of this lemony tea-like flavor. It's really amazing in wit beers. Most beers, though, they do use a different blend of spices. And blending spices can be a little bit overwhelming. It's all about trial and error, experimentation. The best way to do this is to prepare a tea, kind of an herbal tea with your spices. Experiment with different blends till you can get the right balance of flavors and aromas for your beer. And it can save you from over-spicing, rendering it unpalatable. And I've had some spiced beers that were just like eating like a potpourri bag or something. It's just really, really bad. So spices are going to be treated differently depending on what it is. Your really thick things like cocoa nibs, roots like ginger, licorice root, sarsaparilla root, sassafras root, things like that, they should probably be, you can grate them. Ginger's pretty soft enough where you can grate it to get the most out of it. Or you can crush them up a little bit. Typically these will have to go through a boil, and when you're making a beer you can use some of your brewing water and do a boil, and so what you'll do is you'll have your grains. You can have them loose or however you want. I usually use like a funnel with a little screen in there. We got a couple different types. We got a smaller one here. I think we sell these on our website. Still, I'm not sure. These ones are pretty cool. And basically, you know, you make your tea in your kettle or your pot or whatever. Then you just pour it in here. Then, you know, and that'll be part of your brewing water. That's a really nice way to get some subtle flavor without overwhelming it too much. Some spices can be very, very strong. Allspice, clove, mulling spices, such as what we have here. I'll show under the camera here. So this is going to be a mixture of things like, let's see, allspice. Got a little bit of allspice here. And it'll have a little bit of cloves. And it could have a mixture of sweet orange peel or bitter orange peel. Now these are going to be a little different than zest, and you can prepare orange peel like this too if you'd like, just by peeling it and then drying it out. Zest, what I really like zest is it's fresh and it has all those fresh oils. So I mean, you can't really get much more flavor than that. If you want something more subtle, you can use these. The pith, the white parts that are on the skin, they can leave a little bit of bitterness. But I mean, when you're doing like blends like mulling spices, it's not gonna be that big of a deal. I've never really had any problem using these. I just really prefer the fresh stuff personally. And of course, you know, you want to use this guy to get that zest off. And once you get the zest off, or any other, this is what I really like to do. You can either add spices in different parts of the brewing process depending on what it is and what results you're trying to achieve. Some spices contribute most flavor in the boil because you're really boiling the spices up, getting a lot of flavor. Again, this is going to be used for really thick, dense spices, roots, branches, things like that. You won't want to do like fresh herbs or seeds or anything like that in the boil unless you use a very small amount. These are going to be best used in secondary, or a week before bottling or kegging, or 2 weeks before even. You can add them directly to it, but then you're going to risk a little bit of contamination depending on the spice, where it's been, how fresh it is. Especially fresh herbs and fresh spices, they really should be sanitized first. So the trick to sanitizing is to use a pure grain alcohol. Well, what I like to use is Everclear. Now keep in mind, this is illegal in several states in the US, including California, Washington, New York State. So if you can't get this, then you can just get a high proof vodka, or whatever. I mean, if you want to be creative, I recently did an all grain version of my Angry Bovine chocolate milk stout. We do have the Angry Bovine chocolate milk stout on our website, the Mr.Beer version. But what I like to do is I like to take vanilla beans, and vanilla beans is considered a spice, though technically it's a fruit, but in brewing it is used as a spice. I like to take my vanilla beans, split them, take all the seeds, put them in a little container like this little glass, and then score the skins really well and put them in there. And I like to pour a little bit of rum on top. That'll give you a nice kind of little bit of rum flavor, and I did that for my chocolate milk stout, and it came out incredible. So you don't have to use pure grain alcohol. You can use another type of liquor like whiskey or whatever if you're trying to get a little bit of flavor. Just keep in mind that you're using a very, very small amount. So you really just need enough to cover your spices. You don't want to fill it up, just enough to cover it. You'll want to cover the top with a saran wrap, because this will prevent all that alcohol from evaporating. With some items such as lemon peel or citrus peels, or even cocoa nibs, the alcohol can soak into there, so you might look like you're losing a little bit. If you need to, you can add just a little bit more. It usually happens over a few days or so. For your really thicker items, such as like star anise, which I really like to use over licorice root. I think it has a much cleaner, less bitter kind of licorice flavor. Just really nice in porters, and stouts and such. This stuff, you want to crush it up a little bit and add it in there. And you want to let your thicker items like stems, things like this, really dense spices, I add them at the beginning of when I'm making my beer into the alcohol, and then I let it sit for a full 2 weeks or so, for the full time before I add them into the beer. Lighter spices such as, you can use anise seed too. It's a little more subtle than anisette, or the anise, the star anise. When you're using things like coriander, you might want to, just soak it for a few days before you use it, especially with like lemon peel. You literally, like citrus peels, you just need a couple hours. And so the alcohol not only sanitizes your spices or your herbs, it also helps extract a lot of those flavors out, because it is a solvent, and especially this Everclear, which is 190, this is 95% alcohol, 190 proof, which is why it's illegal in some states. It is a really great solvent, and it helps break down that stuff. Now, for you distillers at home, of course, you can use some of your distilled liquor as well, but that's a gray area I'm not going to get into here today. So adding, first, actually, I'm going to talk to you about adding some into your beer. Then we'll go over some of the spices and their uses. So adding spices into your beer, there's several tools you can use. This is for like bigger batches, did a lot of stuff. I do this for my big batches of chocolate milk stout. I soak the cocoa nibs in the alcohol, crush them really good, and then I put them in this and into my batch. Now you can add the spices commando style, or completely naked with nothing, with no muslin sack or anything like that. but you might risk having some of that come out, especially small spices like coriander, stuff like that. It's kind of difficult to, it won't always drop to the bottom like your heavier ones will. So it's good to use, some kind of mesh device like this. We've got the smaller little spice balls, which are really great they're used for teas quite a bit. I sell them in my store because people like to use these for their 2-gallon or 5-gallon batches. I mean, you don't need a lot of spices. So this little tiny ball packed full can do a 10-gallon batch. Of course, you don't want it packed. You need a little bit of space in there so that the spices move around. Otherwise, you're not getting anything out of it. You can even use like tea, like I was saying, different teas, green tea, black tea, all kinds of different stuff. Muslin sacks. These I don't recommend for things like coriander. These again are going to be for your larger spices. We have a pumpkin pie spice we sell on our website, and this is a powder. You can just add this directly in because it's going to settle into the true, and you don't have to worry about that too much. Powders like that, not a big thing. This is a spice that's pretty unique to Arizona here, Mesquite Flour. This is from the bean of the mesquite tree. It's a yellow bean, kind of 6 to 8 inches long, with a bunch of seeds in it. Typically these are ground up, and it adds kind of a lemony vanilla flavor. It's really interesting. Some of them, when they're roasted, can add kind of cocoa notes too. Really cool stuff. That's really awesome to use. Another spice that you've probably seen in one of our past limited time recipes, we did a kind of a Highland style Scottish heather ale, which used these heather tips, little tiny flowers from Scotland. And they add a little bit of a floral bittering quality. This was really, really common back in the day in the UK area during medieval times when they were making beers, because hops weren't as readily available, and heather was. So this was used in a lot of beer. There is a commercial version called Freyok, and it's a Scottish style heather ale that you can purchase on the market. It's pretty common everywhere. I recommend checking that out. Okay, going through some of the spices. Allspice. Let's see, where's my allspice? There it is. I'll just kind of pour out some of these so you can kind of check them out. I mean, you've probably seen these before. They're used in cooking all the time. Allspice is a pretty cool kind of dry little berry. It's used for bitterness. It adds a lot of aroma, and it's also a great preservative. So this was commonly used in a lot of different regions in Europe when they can get it. Of course, before Marco Polo, of course, brought back all the spices and stuff. You can imagine beer was pretty boring at that point, and they only had to use what was local, such as the heather and such. But once the spice trade started happening, they were able to experiment with all kinds of different things, including allspice, I believe, is one of those spices that came over during that time. Star anise, of course. Really cool looking spice. I love the look of this stuff. That one is it'll add a spicy licorice-like flavor. It's really best in the boil. You won't get a lot out of it because of how dense it is if you add it into your secondary. It's for bittering historical beers. I really like using this in stouts and porters, especially like Russian Imperial stouts, and it adds a little extra dimension. I don't like it really strong up forward, just a little bit of licorice to kind of go along with those roasted malts. It's really good. Bay leaf is another one that's been used in beer. It's more recent in experimental brewing. It was never really traditionally used a lot. It will add some bitterness. It is also a preservative, and it will add a significant, that kind of bay aroma. I've never used it before. I'm not sure how I would use bay leaf. I don't know, what kind of style do you guys think bay leaf would work in? Chime in the chat if you want. Caraway, you've seen the little seeds on rye. It's very spicy. Also adds a little bit of an anise-like bitterness. It could be used in a boil. Some seeds are very, very dense and strong, so crushing them a little bit, adding a little to the boil won't hurt. If you crush them enough, use the alcohol method, that works too. Cardamom, this is a really great spice. It's really strong, you can even smell it through the bag. It's really interesting shape. It almost looks like little rocks. Like if you've seen this on the ground, you would just think it was some kind of gravel or something. But this is really great. It's used, it's a very powerful aromatic. It's in the ginger family, and it's used in like Christmas beers mostly. You'll find it in a lot of winter warmer style beers. And of course, these were commonly used in medieval medicinal beers as well. Chili peppers. Chili beers are starting to get really common. Query Beer says in the chat, I like the chili lime recipe. While chili is actually a fruit, it is used as a spice. The way you think about it is there's not really any sugars, fermentable sugars, in things like chili or vanilla bean. While they're technically fruits, they will be used in beer as spices. So we've got some red chili pepper here. Everybody's seen red chili pepper. You probably have hundreds of packets of it from your local pizza delivery place in your drawer somewhere. Really common. Now just red chili flakes is good in beer if you just want to add a little bit of heat and not a lot of flavor. But you know, there's a lot of different chilies you can use. Tim, I believe, did a show a few weeks ago on chili beers and using chili in your beer, so you can always go back to that if you want a little more information about making chili beers. Let's see, go down my list here. Cinnamon's really good. It's a very common in pumpkin ales. I believe our pumpkin pie spice has a little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of allspice, and clove, and a few other things. It's not always true cinnamon. A lot of the cheaper stuff you get in stores is not true cinnamon. It's what is it called? Cassia bark, which is similar, but it's not true cinnamon. True cinnamon can be a little more earthy, so just be careful with that. Citrus, of course, that's lemon peel, sweet peel, orange peel, things like that. We've gone over that. Really common in Belgian-style ales, wit beers. Cloves, very, very powerful to use. Use it very sparingly. It's really good, again, in pumpkin ales and Christmas beers, holiday beers. And I don't, like I was saying earlier, don't use it in your wheat beers if you're using a wheat yeast, because that wheat yeast already creates the phenolic, which is actually the exact same chemical that gives cloves its aroma and flavor. Can't remember off the top of my head the exact name of that phenolic, but it's a long geeky word anyway. Coriander, this is probably one of the most commonly used spices in brewing. It's just little tiny balls. For those of you who don't know, this is the seed of the cilantro plant. This will provide kind of lemony notes, a little bit of peppery, but usually more on the citrusy side. It's kind of got a distinct flavor and aroma. I really love this stuff. I like crushing it up and smelling it. It smells incredible. One of my favorite spices to use, which is kind of rare, don't know if you could find it in your area. This is called Grains of Paradise. These really tiny seeds, and you don't need a lot. It's very, very powerful. It can be quite expensive at times. This was used as a pepper substitute back in medieval times. This was actually more available than like black peppercorn, white peppercorn, things like that. This will create kind of peppery flavors with a little bit of citrus and kind of piney notes as well. It's really interesting to use. Again, it's very, very strong. The seeds are really, really hard, so you really have to crush them really good. Mortar and pestle works the best for that. I use this in my lemon pepper saison, which I use lemon peel, coriander, grains of paradise. I crush up the coriander, grains of paradise, and the lemon, and I put them all in a little cup with a little bit of Everclear, and let those soak up a little bit, and it gets a lot of flavor. Oh, and of course black peppercorn in my lemon pepper saison, but just a little bit, not a lot, because black peppercorn can also be a bit overwhelming. I went to the National Homebrewers Conference in Minneapolis last year, about this time last year, and a homebrewer there had a peppercorn wit beer, and it was really, really strong on the black pepper. Now, I love black pepper, so it was kind of my thing, but a lot of people just were not into it. So you just got to be careful with some of your flavors. Dill is another flavor. It's not used that much. It will add some spice and even kind of an anise-like flavor when added to your boil. I don't know of a lot of recipes or people that have made beer with dill, though I do plan on doing a goza. Again, these are kind of salty, sour beers. I've been wanting to make a dill pickle goza. I know it's strange. It's an experiment of mine I've been wanting to do. But you know, with cucumbers and dill in there, you know, with that lactic acid giving a little bit of that tart, and the dill, and then of course the salt giving a little bit of that kind of briny note. I think it'd be pretty good, honestly. And I love dill pickles. So let's see, Corthane bay leaf might work in a red or brown. Yeah, actually that would probably be a good idea. I think it would probably work in kind of a sweeter beer than something a little drier, but I don't know. I've never used it. IPA, bay leaf in an IPA, Deadhood 77 says that's a possibility as well. I'm not sure how it would work with the hops. Maybe choose some hops that would work with it well. I think it would work better maybe in like an English style IPA with the more earthy, spicy English hops. Go ahead and answer these other chats. Guess my break just a little bit longer. Maybe drinking some large quantities once this week is over. You and me both, buddy. I just got done moving, so I'm gonna be tired by this weekend. All right, moving on. Dill, that sounds amazing to me. Nick Ball says, "Oh, the dill pickle beer, yeah, I think it's gonna be awesome." Fennel, Fennel is also another anise-like. There's so many of these things that just taste like licorice, but some of them will have different compounds. They might vary. So go out and pick up all these different herbs and make a little bit of tea with it, and just kind of smell and taste and see how they work. Try to find combinations that work together, because a combination may sound okay in your head, but on your palate, your tongue says no. So that's always good to experiment. Ginger is a very popular root, a very popular spice used in a lot of beers. There is even ginger beer, which is pretty much just ginger. Typically it's a soda, but there are hard ones out too you can get with a little alcohol in them. We have a couple recipes on our website that use ginger in them. Not a lot of ginger, but they do have a little bit of ginger. Ginger is really awesome. I like ginger in a lot of different like sour beers. Saisons can do well with some ginger in them, but it can be overpowering. So just again, be careful with some of these. Juniper is one of the original, one of the first herbs. I mean, historically speaking, one of the first herbs used in beer for bittering. Is really common in historical Scandinavian brewing, in like Norwegian farmhouse ales. Finnish satis. Sati is kind of a raw beer that doesn't go through a boil. Has a lot of spice and flavors. And in those beers historically, now they didn't have like false bottoms and things like that for brewing their beer. So they would use juniper boughs, which are basically the branches and leaves of a juniper tree, the younger branches and leaves that are pliable, and they would kind of just spread them around in circles on the bottom of their mash tun, and all their grains would go on top of that. And that would add not just flavor from juniper berries, that kind of distinct gin-like flavor. It also adds some kind of woody notes from the branches. I tried making something similar recently using a Norwegian kvik yeast, or quike yeast is how it's actually pronounced. And I didn't have access to the boughs, so I just used juniper berries and put them in the mash. And I used a little bit of smoke malt, which was kind of traditional, and it came out pretty good. Some people it's a little bit too smoky, which can be the case for most people, but I really liked it. I really like smoky beers. And let's see, what else? Oh, and by the way, fun fact, it's actually those Scandinavian beers, you've heard the term rule of thumb, right? A lot of people have said that. It's a really common term used. That actually comes from brewing. Back in those days, medieval times, throughout Scandinavia and throughout Europe, they didn't have like thermometers, things like that to use. So how would they know that their mash is hot enough for brewing? Well, once you get about past 170 degrees, it'll start to hurt you. So if you stick your thumb in the mash and it's hot, but just that on that border where it's not hurting, then it's ready to go. And that's where rule of thumb came from. It's an old historical term that came out of brewing. Okay, so moving on our herbs here. Licorice, another one of the original bittering spices. This was used many years. Some of the original first porters and stouts that ever came out were spiced. I mean, in fact, a lot of beers back in those days were dark. Like pretty much every beer was dark because they didn't have the control that we have these days for roasting their malts. So pretty much everything was dark back then. Everything was considered a stout and a porter. Mace is a kind of a good alternative to nutmeg if you don't want really strong, overpowering flavor. But both mace and nutmeg can be used in winter warmers, holiday ales, things like that. Sometimes in pumpkin pie beers, especially nutmeg. Nutmeg is really common in pumpkin beers. I've been wanting to make an eggnog stout. I know that's another weird beer. I have all these weird beer ideas. But using nutmeg and lactose sugar and cocoa nibs, a lot of vanilla, just kind of try to get that kind of eggnog flavor to come through in a stout. I think it would be very interesting. A lot of people don't like eggnog, so I'll forgive you. Parsley, which is strange. I've never used it in a beer or seen it used, but I have read that people have used it for a little bit of spice. My feeling, it might make it a little bit grassy, but people have used it. Peppercorn, we've gone over that. Quassia, which is actually a wood. It's kind of a bark. And it's quinine-like. It's used in a lot of root beers. It'd be kind of similar to like sassafras or sarsaparilla root. And those are also very common. Not so much in beers, though I have seen sarsaparilla root used in stouts and porters in small amounts, giving a nice pleasant flavor. It could make it taste kind of sweet because these barks kind of have this natural kind of sweetness to them, so you don't want to overdo it. And vanilla, finally on my list here, which is again a fruit, but it is probably the most used spice there is these days, especially with the stouts using them. They're even putting them in those new milkshake IPAs, hazy IPAs, vanilla bean with some fruit and lactose sugar. Vanilla is really versatile. You can either use the beans, which I think gives the more the kind of fresher, real flavor, but more subtle, or you can use extract. Now, if you're using extract, be sure you're using real, pure vanilla extract and not the fake vanilla, which is called vanillin, because that can really give kind of a fake chemically flavor. And speaking of extracts, I have a couple here from Northwest Extract Companies. This is just straight spice flavor. It's kind of really clovey, a little bit of licorice in there. This one is a pumpkin pie flavor. So yeah, this one's going to be a little bit, that more sweeter. You actually get a little bit of vanilla, kind of that graham cracker crust in here too. I really like using extracts because they're very easy to dose, and it's just a lot easier, especially for consistency over batches. A lot of breweries do use extracts, but they can come off as being a little artificial depending on the company that makes your extract, how it's made. Some of them are alcohol-based, some of them are kind of just water-based, and you want to make sure there's not a lot of preservatives in them either. I just say stick with the fresh stuff. As long as you're using it properly, it'll work great. Thank you, Hophead Hardware, for the 45 bits. Definitely appreciate it. Anytime you get bits, you can actually, by the way, guys, you can get free bits on here just by watching ads, which everybody hates ads, but that creates revenue that goes. It doesn't go to us, but it goes to the Southern Arizona Humane Society. So anytime you subscribe or buy bits or earn bits and then cheer with them, it's called cheering. That'll help out dogs down here in Arizona find homes. Dogs, cats, lizards, birds, all kinds of different animals. What am I forgetting? I think that's pretty much it. I've gone over all the different spices. Do you guys have any Hophead Hardware? Man, you told me how to pronounce Queek, you deserve it. Yeah, just keep in mind in Scandinavian languages, Norwegian languages, V is usually pronounced like a W. So, queek. It's pretty easy. All right, you guys have any more questions about spices? And there are a lot of different exotic spices too that I really want to try out. Can't think of any off the top of my head, but there's this little market here in Tucson, Lily's I think it's called, and they have like all kinds of cool exotic fruits and spices, and I might even I think it would be a good idea maybe do an episode on some of these exotic things and how they can be used in beers. So that might be something we'll do in the future. Deadhood77 asks, is there a kit that the pumpkin spice goes with? Yes, we do have. Do you know which one that is, Matt? We have like 3 or 4 different pumpkin beer recipes. I believe it's one of our newest ones. If you go on our website and just type pumpkin in the search bar, they'll all pop up.
Pumpkin spice ale, pumpkin rising.
Yeah. Hophead Hardware asks, how fine do you crush coriander? You don't want to pulverize it. You're not trying to make a powder. You're basically just trying to crack them. You just want to crack them really nice, bust them open. You just don't want to pulverize them. That's going to be true with any seeds. You really just want to crack them open. It's just like grains when you're milling grains for making your beer. You don't want to make it into a powder because then it just kind of clumps together once the water hits it, and it doesn't really do anything. You need to have those spaces in between so that you have efficiency with your water so you can pull out all those flavors. Exciter, thanks, great information. Anytime, man. Thank you very much for joining us too. Deadhood77, yeah, Matt went ahead and posted up the pumpkin beers.
Yeah, just the list of searching for pumpkin. Like 5 beers, 4 different recipes.
Yeah, and one thing about pumpkin ales, pumpkin beers, you know, I'm not really into them. They tend to be way too spicy. Though I have had a few pumpkin. Who makes pumpkin, Matt? Do you remember?
Wasatch?
Wasatch? Yeah, I think
Wasatch.
I think Wasatch makes that. Pumpkin is good because you can actually taste the pumpkin. With most pumpkin beers, like you just taste the spice. You know, there's not really any pumpkin flavor in it whatsoever. But you can, some beers, they do add a lot of pumpkin. And if you are adding pumpkin, I know this is kind of off topic from the spices, but since it is a beer that you're using spices in, I might as well tell you the best way to prepare the pumpkin. It's really best to cut the pumpkin up in like sections, like
Southern Tier, sorry.
Oh, Southern Tier, yes. Oh, thanks, Hophead Hardware. Southern Tier makes it. Yeah, that's a really good one. That's probably my favorite pumpkin beer. But roasting the pumpkin a little bit will actually help caramelize some of the sugars on the outside. Make it roasted in your oven where it's like, you know, kind of bubbly and brown. I'm sure you've made squash like with butter on it. It's like nice and bubbly and brown, or brown sugar, and it's like really nice looking. You can even add a little bit of brown sugar to the pumpkin if you want, especially for like a pumpkin stout, things like that. That'll help caramelize the sugars in the pumpkin as well. And so by caramelizing some of the sugars in the pumpkin, you're going to have a lot more flavor because they're not going to all ferment out, if you catch my drift. So that's basically the best way to do it. Roast your pumpkin. Don't use like the Libby's canned pumpkin stuff unless it's doesn't have spices in it. Some of them are pre-spiced, and you don't want to use those. They can be a little overwhelming because you're really trying to strike a balance. So just use fresh pumpkin or canned pumpkin that is unspiced. I like using fresh pumpkin because, again, you can bake it really nice. Canned pumpkin, you can still do it, just you'll have to spread it out over like wax paper on a cookie sheet, and really thin, and just kind of roast it that way. So still, you can do it, but fresh pumpkin is where it's at. All right, guys, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. We definitely appreciate when you come and hang out with us here at the Real Mr.Beer, and we will be seeing you next week. Tuesday will be Tim will be back on next Tuesday, talking probably making some more beer. Wednesday I'll probably be I know I haven't brewed any beer in the past few episodes, so I'll probably brew something up next Wednesday. I'll try to figure out what I'll do. Probably do something a little interesting, a little advanced for you guys. We'll see. Anyway, thanks a lot, guys, for joining us, and we will see you next week. Cheers.